If they get there before me, Article 31. The text was from an unknown number. Was Miranda playing a game? It first came up not long after we started dating. Article 31 started as a joke. Would we cover for each other if one of us ever fell foul of the law? Nothing serious, misdemeanor type offenses that could result in a fine, of course. A white lie to the police to save the trouble. It needed a code name, and so Article 31 was born. 2 hours later, Miranda breezed through the door. Have they been here? Who? Good. What is going on? A knock at the door, the police. Can we come in? Sure. Miranda served them coffee. Her hand lowered the cup to the table in a calm and smooth sweep. If she was nervous, she hid it well. I pressed my hands between my knees. Where were you tonight? Home here with Derek. The older of the two officers looked at me. Is that true? Yes. Is there anyone else who can verify? No, I don't think so. The officer turned back to Miranda. When was the last time you were in Springfield? I'm not sure I've ever been. Never. It's an hour down the road and on the way to the city. I have passed through. I cleared my throat. What is this in relation to? The younger officer leaned forward. We ask the questions. Witness saw a blue Prius on Olive Parade at 9 p.m. tonight. That wasn't you? Miranda shrugged. There's a lot of blue Priuses out there. We got a partial plate, too, and a neighbor of one of the victims saw the suspect. Blonde, slim, around 25, all a match. A partial plate leaves room for doubt, no, and I have my alibi. The older officer took a sip of coffee. Derek, is it? You'll sign a statement to verify her alibi? I nodded. They put the paper in front of me. The officer stood. We'll be in touch. Don't do anything stupid like leave town. After they left, Miranda placed her palms on my cheeks and kissed me. You were great. What did you do? Nothing. It's a case of mistaken identity. Where have you been? Nowhere. Is there any pasta left over? I went upstairs early. I Googled what I knew. Springfield, multiple victims, Olive Parade. And then it came up. Couple stabbed to death in their home. The article didn't name the victims, but it wasn't hard to find elsewhere. One of the names was familiar. Chris Marks. Miranda had mentioned him. I was sure of it. Something from her past she didn't get into. Had she killed 2 people tonight and got me to cover? She thought ahead enough to text me from a different phone. Was this a long con? And what now? She had my alibi. Signed. Am I next? I can hear footsteps on the stairs. She's coming up. So I, a 36-year-old male, have been with my girlfriend Chloe, 35, for the last 2 years. We are in a really happy relationship, and I have even considered marrying her in the near future. The only issue I have with her is that she is constantly comparing me to her ex-boyfriend, Mark. It is really annoying, and it's kind of starting to hurt my feelings. If I ever do something wrong, then she always would point out that Mark wouldn't have made that mistake. I know that they were childhood sweethearts and were together for over 10 years, but I really think she needs to stop doing this. She always gives me the silent treatment afterwards when I ask her to stop, which always makes me feel like I did something wrong. It has really started to get on my nerves, so I decided to organize a meeting between the three of us and make her choose which one of us she wants. I knew she would be home late on Sunday evening, so I decided that was the perfect day for the meeting. Me and Mark were sitting at the kitchen table when she walked in. I could see the look of shock on her face when she saw him. She fainted to the ground, and I knew that she wanted Mark. I decided I would stand aside and let them be together. I placed Mark's rotting corpse back into his grave, and then carefully lowered Chloe on top of him before closing the coffin. I started throwing the dirt on top of the grave so that no one would ever know it was disturbed. I could hear Chloe's screams of what I assume are joy as she was finally reunited with the love of her life. I felt horrible that we were breaking up, but didn't want to stand in the way of true love. I grew up in a home with two parents who absolutely despised each other and only stayed together because it was easier for them than getting divorced. It really gave me a fucked up view on how relationships should work. Unfortunately for me, this meant that a lot of my girlfriends would end up dumping me due to how miserable our relationships were. I just assumed that my parents' way of treating each other was the way I should interact with them. I will admit that I was never in love with any of them. The first person I ever fell in love with was my coworker, Lisa. I remember standing there speechless the first time we were introduced. I had never seen anyone so beautiful in my entire life. The chemistry between us was instantaneous, and we were always flirting with each other. We ended up being the talk of the office, as all of my other coworkers were gossiping about us behind our back. I ended up being her shoulder to cry on after her last relationship ended. Over the course of a few weeks, we ended up falling in love and quickly moved in together. She still reminisces, sometimes, about her former fiancé, and I try to console her as best as I can. It is hard not to smile, though, as I remember the look on his face as I swerved onto that pavement and hit him with my car. I had to reverse over his face a few times just to make sure he was dead and to teach him not to get in the way of true love. My boyfriend's friend John is a theater guy into local community theater groups. He asked my boyfriend to go with him to see this comedic adaptation of Dracula, which some of his friends were putting on. My boyfriend asked me if I wanted to join, and even though horror and all that isn't really my thing, I agreed. Things are slowly opening up after the pandemic, and I hadn't been to a live play in forever. So the three of us drove to this suburban theater. I picked up some weird vibes from John. It looked like he had no idea I was joining them. There were graphics of Dracula everywhere in the theater, black with red dripping from his fangs. I don't know why grown men get so excited about Dracula, but John and my boyfriend were super into it, excitedly Googling different movie versions while I sipped on a glass of wine. It was an all-female troupe, but the long day and comfortable chairs and wine was getting me, and I was zoned out. Everything became blurry. I remember the Lucy Mina plotline. When the vampires bit Lucy, blood spurted everywhere, and she slumped heavily. An acrid, sour smell rose into the air. I felt uneasy for the first time. I glanced at the guys, and John's eyes were glowing in the dark lights. At the interval, we went back into the bar, and I got another glass of wine. The guys were chatting about the special effects and how realistic the blood looked. Then John offered to take my boyfriend backstage and meet the actors. My boyfriend turned to me and asked if I wanted to go, but I was happy nursing my wine at the bar. The two went off. 5 minutes passed. The bell rang, and there was no sign of them. I got up and followed the arrow printed backstage. I came to a door with a sign, "The Star, please knock." I opened the door. My boyfriend was slumped back in an ornate gold armchair, half facing me, his eyes closed. Lady Dracula was bent over him, her teeth sunk into his neck, exactly like the scene with Lucy. Blood and lipstick were smeared scarlet on his neck. And John was standing over them, his face lit up with glee. I don't know how long I was standing there staring at them. My boyfriend moved slightly, his eyelids fluttered. John looked at me and put his fingers on his lips. Somebody moved in the background. A voice outside called, "Time, please." My paralysis broke. I turned and fled down the long corridor, following the neon flickering exit signs. I ran as fast as I could, and soon enough I was pushing a door, stepping outside in the fresh air. I found the car, I jumped in and sped away. I broke up with my boyfriend via text once I was home, and never saw him after that. I sat in the backyard of my parents' home, watching my sister Jane open presents. She smiled and held up the onesie. I smiled and turned towards my wife Emily, who looked at me and gave me a half-hearted smile back. We had been married for 5 years, trying for a baby for 3. "It's all I've ever wanted," she told me on our first date. But after 2 years of trying and failing for a baby, we finally went to see a doctor. It was me. Slow swimmers, some call it. I remember how devastated I felt. I let her down, took away the one thing she wanted most in life. I could feel her resentment towards me grow. Dishes began to break after arguments, insults hurled at me. In sickness and health, I would tell myself, trying to stay and work through IVF with her, although that seemed to fail too. Her words snapped me out of my daydream. "I have to use the restroom," she said quietly to me as she got up. I saw tears glistening in her eyes and felt guilt for bringing her to my sister's gender reveal, but she assured me that it was okay when we got the invitation. A few minutes went by and I became bored, so I wandered inside for food. I stopped inside to talk with my brother-in-law for a bit, and then went back outside. Not seeing Jane or Emily, I wandered back inside, thinking maybe I hadn't seen them enter. I walked around until I was upstairs by the bathroom, when I started hearing a soft cry that sounded like Emily's. I asked if she was in there. She didn't answer. I began to become worried when I remembered the key my parents hid when I was young. My hand ran across the top of the doorframe until I felt it. I slid the key into the lock and opened the door. I wish I hadn't. The bathtub held my sister's body, stained a deep red. It dripped off her fingers into the puddle on the floor. Her mouth was gagged, and her arms reached out to the doorway, eyes opened. I could see the agony and horror etched onto her face. Her other arm was down on her belly, where the baby had lived and grown for 7 months. She was cut down the middle, empty. And Emily. She was pale and shaking covered in blood. She held a needle and thread. She looked to the door when she saw me, face soaked in tears. She had deep gashes down her face, like claws. As she saw me, she smiled and looked down at her stomach, now larger than before, skin pulled tight, unnatural, cut in half. She winced as the needle and thread pulled through skin, humming a lullaby through racking sobs and moans. When she was done, she looked up at me, smiled, and said, "It's a boy."